The Center for Public Integrity, a nonpartisan investigative journalism organization, documented 935 false statements made by senior Bush administration officials in the 2 years before the Iraq War. These were not matters of interpretation or contested intelligence. They were specific, verifiable claims about Iraqi weapons programs, al-Qaeda connections, and nuclear capabilities that were contradicted by the intelligence available to the officials making them at the time they made them. 935 statements. 8 senior officials, 2 years. All used to justify an invasion that the administration had decided to conduct before the evidence for it existed. If the stated reasons were false, and they were, what were the real ones? That is the question this episode is built to examine. The decision to invade Iraq was made before the intelligence justifying it was assembled. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the conclusion of the Downing Street Memo, a classified British government document from July 2002, 8 months before the invasion, which recorded that American intelligence was being fixed around the policy. It is also the conclusion of the Senate Intelligence Committee's Phase 2 report, the Iraq Study Group, and multiple subsequent investigations. The invasion of Iraq was a political decision that preceded the intelligence case for it. The intelligence case was constructed afterward to provide the political decision with a legal and public justification. Colin Powell's presentation to the UN Security Council on February 5, 2003, was the most consequential public intelligence presentation in modern American history, and the most thoroughly discredited. Powell presented satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and source testimony as definitive evidence of Iraqi weapons programs. In almost every detail, the presentation was subsequently shown to be wrong, misleading, or fabricated. The mobile biological weapons laboratories didn't exist. The al-Qaeda connection was disputed by the intelligence community at the time. The nuclear aluminum tubes had been assessed by technical experts as unsuitable for uranium enrichment. Powell later called it a blot on my record. He knew before he delivered it that significant portions were contested. The weapons of mass destruction were never found. The mobile biological weapons labs were not mobile weapons labs. They were hydrogen generation trailers for weather balloons, a finding that the Defense Intelligence Agency had in its possession before the invasion. The nuclear program that was described as active was the remnant of a program that had been effectively dismantled after the 1991 Gulf War. The al-Qaeda connection was fabricated. Saddam Hussein's secular Ba'athist government and al-Qaeda's Islamist ideology were fundamentally incompatible, a fact that senior American intelligence analysts had noted in pre-war assessments that were not given to policymakers. The war was built on a foundation that the people building it knew was unstable. If the stated reasons were false, and they demonstrably were, then understanding the real reasons requires going back to what this series has built over 7 episodes: the relationship between oil, dollar dominance, and American strategic power in the Middle East. The Iraq War did not come from nowhere. It came from a specific strategic logic, a specific set of interests, and a specific event that most people have never heard of, an event that happened in October 2000, when Saddam Hussein made a decision that directly threatened the architecture of American global financial power. Stay with me. In October 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would switch its oil sales under the UN Oil for Food program from US dollars to euros. The switch was completed in November 2000. It was the first time a major OPEC producer had priced oil in a currency other than the US dollar since the Petrodollar system was established in 1974. And it was profitable because the euro had been strengthening against the dollar since late 1999. Iraq actually gained approximately 26% more purchasing power for its oil by pricing in euros. Other OPEC members noticed. Iran was already discussing the possibility. Venezuela was exploring it. To understand why this mattered so much, why it threatened the architecture of American financial power, you have to understand what the petrodollar system actually does. As covered in Episode 4, since 1974, virtually all global oil has been priced and traded in US dollars. This creates a structural global demand for dollars that is independent of America's economic performance. Every country that needs to buy oil needs to hold dollar reserves. This keeps the dollar strong, keeps American borrowing costs low, and gives the United States an extraordinary privilege: the ability to print the world's reserve currency and have the world absorb the cost. If oil is priced in euros instead of dollars, that structural demand for dollars collapses, the privilege ends, and the United States becomes, financially, a more ordinary country. The petrodollar war theory fully developed by economist William Clark in his 2003 book, argues that the United States does not invade countries to seize their oil directly. It invades countries that threaten to price oil in currencies other than the dollar, thereby protecting the structural mechanism that gives the dollar its global dominance. The evidence cited includes Iraq's 2000 switch to euros, the subsequent 2003 invasion, and the Coalition Provisional Authority's immediate reversion of Iraqi oil sales to dollars after Saddam's fall. It also cites Libya, which was discussing a gold-backed African currency for oil transactions before the 2011 NATO intervention, and Iran, which established an oil bourse pricing oil in non-dollar currencies, and has faced continuous American pressure since. The pattern, its proponents argue, is not coincidental. The counter-argument to the petrodollar war theory is equally important and must be presented honestly. Critics note that the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency does not depend solely on oil pricing. It depends on the depth, liquidity, and trustworthiness of American financial markets, the rule of law, and global trade patterns that cannot be disrupted by a single commodity's pricing currency. They note that Iraqi oil sales under the Oil for Food program were a tiny fraction of global oil trade, too small to meaningfully threaten dollar dominance. They note that the Bush administration's internal deliberations, as revealed by former Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, centered on WMD regional security and Iraq's relationship with terrorism, not on currency denomination. The petrodollar motive, critics argue, is an elegant theory that overstates the mechanism. The truth, as the evidence suggests, is almost certainly more complex than either the petrodollar war theory or its critics allow. The 2003 Iraq War was probably motivated by multiple overlapping interests: oil access, regional security, the demonstration of American military resolve after September 11, personal political agendas within the Bush administration, and, yes, the structural interest in maintaining dollar dominance that the petrodollar system represents. None of these motivations excludes the others, and none of them were the ones presented to the American public and the UN Security Council. That is the documented fact that matters most. To understand why the 2003 decision was strategically catastrophic, you have to understand why the 1991 decision was strategically sound, and why George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft explained their reasoning so clearly that their explanation became the warning that was ignored. The 1991 Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, achieved its stated objective in 100 hours of ground combat. Iraq was expelled from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia's oil supply was secured, and the Carter Doctrine was vindicated. Bush Sr. then made the decision that would be most debated in the decade that followed. He stopped at the Iraqi border. He did not march to Baghdad. In their 1998 memoir, A World Transformed, Bush and Scowcroft wrote about this decision with unusual candor. They had calculated that removing Saddam would shatter Iraq's social fabric, that Iraq was held together by Saddam's authoritarian force, and that without it, the country would fragment along ethnic and sectarian lines. They calculated that Iran, Shia majority, historically connected to Iraq's Shia majority, would be the primary beneficiary of Saddam's removal, expanding its regional influence at American expense. They calculated that the Arab coalition partners who had supported Desert Storm would not support a march to Baghdad, and they calculated that the United States would be left occupying a country it could not govern, in a region it had just destabilized. Every one of these calculations proved correct 12 years later, under a different Bush. The decision-making process inside the Bush Jr. administration that led to the 2003 invasion is now documented in considerable detail through the memoirs of participants, congressional investigations, and declassified documents. Former Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, who was present at the first National Security Council meeting of the Bush administration in January 2001, stated that Iraq was on the agenda from the very first meeting, not as a response to September 11, 2001, which had not yet happened, but as a pre-existing objective. The documents O'Neill saw described the post-Saddam distribution of Iraq's oil fields. They were dated January 2001. September 11 provided the political opportunity to act on a decision that had already been made. The role of Dick Cheney in the Iraq War decision deserves specific examination. Cheney was the most influential vice president in American history, and his influence on Iraq policy was documented and decisive. In 2002, before the war was publicly decided, Cheney met with Ahmed Chalabi at the American Enterprise Institute's annual retreat. Planning, as documented by Ron Suskind, and Iraq that would be a Western-oriented oil producer with production sharing agreements favorable to American companies. Cheney's Energy Task Force in 2001, whose proceedings were kept secret, included maps of Iraqi oil fields and lists of companies interested in Iraqi oil contracts. The task force met in January 2001. The war began in March 2003. The question this segment leaves open, intentionally, is the relationship between the oil interest and the decision to invade. Was oil the cause of the war? Was it a consequence that was planned for? Was it a contributing factor among several? The honest answer is, the evidence supports all three interpretations, and no document yet declassified establishes definitively which was primary. What the evidence does establish, beyond reasonable dispute, is that the stated reasons were false, that oil was present in the decision-making from the earliest planning stages, and that the war produced oil-related outcomes that benefited specific interests. The weight of those three facts is for you to assess. Whatever its causes, the consequences of the 2003 Iraq War are documented and devastating. And they are consequences that George H.W. Bush's analysis predicted with almost complete accuracy. Iraq fragmented along sectarian lines. The Shia majority, long suppressed under Saddam, aligned politically and militarily with Iran, giving Tehran the regional influence that Bush Sr. had identified as the primary strategic risk of Saddam's removal. The Sunni minority, stripped of power and dignity by the de-Baathification program that disbanded Iraq's military and civil service, provided the recruitment base for al-Qaeda in Iraq, which evolved through a series of organizational transformations into the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIS was not an accident. It was a predictable consequence of a specific policy decision. The de-Baathification policy, implemented by CPA Administrator L. Paul Bremer in May 2003 over the objections of American military commanders on the ground, dissolved the Iraqi army and fired 400,000 trained soldiers without pay or prospects. It dismissed tens of thousands of civil servants, teachers, and administrators who were Ba'ath Party members, not because of ideology, but because Ba'ath Party membership was required for government employment in Saddam's Iraq. The result was the simultaneous creation of an enormous pool of trained, armed, humiliated men with no income and no future, and the collapse of the administrative infrastructure needed to run a country. Bush Sr. had predicted this. American military commanders had warned against it. Bremer did it in a memo that took approximately 48 hours to produce. The Iraq War's effect on American credibility, strategic, diplomatic, and moral, was catastrophic and lasting. The failure to find WMD established that the intelligence community could be politicized and its assessments distorted. The Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal established that American values under pressure were not as advertised. The failure of the reconstruction effort, $60 billion spent with minimal measurable improvement in Iraqi living standards, established that American state-building capability was not what American policymakers believed it to be. And the transformation of Iraq into a primary arena of Iranian influence established that the strategic rationale for the invasion, whatever it actually was, had produced the exact opposite of its intended regional outcome. The oil dimension of the Iraq War's consequences deserves honest assessment, because it did not produce what either proponents of the petrodollar theory or critics of American oil imperialism expected. Iraq did not become a reliable American-friendly oil producer. The oil contracts that emerged from post-invasion Iraq went disproportionately to Chinese, Russian, and European companies, not primarily to American ones. Iraqi oil production increased significantly after 2010, but the beneficiary of that increase was the Iraqi state and international energy markets broadly, not specifically American companies. The petrodollar was maintained. Iraqi oil remained dollar-denominated, but the specific corporate oil interests that critics anticipated did not materialize as predicted. The war was possibly about oil. It was not successfully about oil. The human cost of the Iraq War is the fact that must not be lost in the strategic analysis. Conservative estimates, those accepted by the Iraqi government and most Western governments, place Iraqi civilian deaths at between 150,000 and 460,000. The Lancet studies and other epidemiological surveys have suggested higher figures. Over 4 million Iraqis were displaced, the largest refugee crisis in the Middle East before Syria. 4,424 American service members were killed. 32,000 were wounded. The cost to the United States alone exceeded $2 trillion. These are not statistics. They are the human price of a decision built on false intelligence, motivated by interests that were never honestly disclosed, and executed without a viable plan for what came after. The Iraq War broke something in American foreign policy that has not been fully repaired. The specific thing it broke was the credibility of the case for American military intervention. The assumption, held since WWE, that when the United States presented intelligence to the international community and argued for the necessity of military action, that case could be taken seriously. After Iraq, it cannot. When the Obama administration presented its case for action in Syria in 2013, American allies, including Britain, declined to support it. The ghost of Iraq was in every parliamentary debate. When any American administration now presents intelligence justifying military action, the first question any informed observer asks is this another Iraq? The Iraq War also produced the conditions for the current US-China-Russia strategic competition in the Middle East, which is the most consequential geopolitical development of the 2020s. America's credibility collapse and strategic overextension opened space for China and Russia to offer an alternative model of engagement with Middle Eastern states. No democracy promotion, no human rights conditions, no regime change, just trade, investment, and arms sales with no political strings. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and other regional states have been actively diversifying their strategic partnerships away from exclusive American alignment, a process that the Iraq War accelerated by demonstrating the costs of American partnership and the limits of American power. The unipolar moment that followed the Cold War ended in Iraq. The Iraq War's most underappreciated legacy may be its effect on American domestic politics. The war that was sold with false intelligence, that produced a humanitarian catastrophe that cost $2 trillion and achieved none of its stated objectives. This war fed a deep and lasting American skepticism about institutional authority, expert consensus, and governmental honesty that has not abated. The specific grievance, we were lied to. People died, no one was held accountable, became a template for how significant portions of the American public now process institutional claims of any kind. The distrust that characterizes American political culture in the 2020s was not born in 2016. It was seeded in Iraq. No senior official of the Bush administration was prosecuted for the false intelligence presentations that led to the war. No accountability mechanism was applied to the architects of the de-Baathification policy that created the conditions for ISIS, the torture program that was implemented in American detention facilities. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. The CIA's enhanced interrogation program was reviewed, documented, and its architects faced no criminal consequences. The war's financial costs were not paid by those who authorized them. They were borrowed, added to the national debt, and passed to future generations. The specific lesson that the Iraq War taught about American accountability is there is none. And the countries that were watching, including Iran, China, and Russia, noted it carefully. In Episode 8, we go to the event that most unexpectedly reversed the strategic damage of the Iraq War on American energy positioning, the shale revolution. Between 2008 and 2018, American domestic oil production more than doubled, making the United States the world's largest oil producer for the first time since the 1970s. The shale revolution changed the geopolitical calculus that every previous episode in this series was built on, including the US-Saudi relationship, OPEC's power, and the entire logic of American military presence in the Gulf. But it also raised a question that nobody in Washington had seriously planned for. What happens to the petrodollar system when America no longer needs to import oil? That question is Episode 8. This episode has examined the most contested question in this series with the evidence the historical record provides. The Iraq War was built on false intelligence. That is documented and undisputed. Oil was present in the decision-making from the earliest planning stages. That is documented and undisputed. The petrodollar motive, that the war was conducted specifically to prevent a threat to dollar-denominated oil pricing, is a coherent theory supported by a specific sequence of documented events, but not definitively established by currently available evidence. What is established is that the war's stated justifications were false. Its strategic outcomes were catastrophic. Its human costs were enormous, and no one who designed it faced accountability. That combination is the Iraq War's historical verdict, regardless of which motivation was primary. The Iraq War's place in this series is specific. It is the moment when the American oil and security architecture, built episode by episode from 1945 onward, began to consume itself. The logic that justified American military presence in the Gulf, protecting the oil supply that powers the global economy, was extended in 2003 to justify the removal of a government that had begun to challenge the financial mechanism through which that oil was priced. Whether that extension was the primary cause of the war or a contributing factor, it represents the furthest reach of the petrodollar system's logic and its most catastrophic application. The system's costs, for the first time, exceeded its benefits, and the world noticed. This is episode 7 of our series on oil and world power. The thread that has run from the WWI oil war through WWE, through the Cold War, through the Iranian Revolution, has now arrived at its most recent chapter before the present. The Iraq War's consequences are the direct predecessors of the current geopolitical environment. The rise of Chinese influence in the Middle East, the de-dollarization pressure on the petrodollar, the Iranian regional expansion, the fragmentation of the American alliance system. Episode 8 brings the series to the shale revolution and what it changed and what it didn't. Episode 9 examines the de-dollarization challenge. And episode 10 closes the series with the question that now defines the energy future. Who will control the transition to renewables? And will that competition look like the oil wars of the past century? 7 episodes in this series has traced 110 years of oil power and the decisions that shaped the world you live in. From the original oil war of WI to the most contested invasion in American history. Each episode has added a piece to an architecture that now, in the final 3 episodes, comes fully into focus. The architecture of the present, the de-dollarization challenge. The shale revolution's geopolitical consequences, the competition for the energy of the future. If you've made it to episode 7, you have the foundation to understand the present, that most people, most journalists, most commentators, most political analysts are missing. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. And the next episode changes how you understand a development that has been called the most significant shift in American geopolitical power since WWI. You will not want to miss it.